Hello everyone, this is a screencast to review some of the details of our unit of market failures government intervention. This is not a technical screencast in the sense that there's no graphical models here, but really it's just kind of a descriptive overview of what are market failures and when and how do governments intervene to correct market failures. So the first thing to do is to look at what we mean when we say a market failure. We say a market fails when it is unable to provide socially optimal outcomes. And this is the key idea here, the socially optimal outcome. What is socially optimal is often what we would call a judgment call. In other words, we may think that wages are too low in a particular region, and therefore we need to intervene and institute a price control, in other words, a minimum wage. That is a judgment. Others might not think wages are too low. There's differences of opinion. We might think that secondhand smoke creates something we call negative externalities for those around the smoker and the secondhand. The people who are victims of the secondhand smoke have no opportunity to stop the other person from smoking. They have no say in the market. That also might be a judgment call. That's what we mean, whether the extent to which secondhand smoke is a problem. So we want to understand that there is a way we can diagram socially optimal outcomes and see how certain solutions deviate from the socially optimal outcome, but it's still a judgment call, the extent to which we deviate from socially optimal outcomes. When a market shows a surplus or a shortage, that's not a market failure. That's not a market failure. That is just simply a market in what we call disequilibrium. Sometimes students will make a mistake and say that the market fails because there is a surplus, and then the market failure is fixed when the market returns to equilibrium. That's not a failure. A failure is when the market is in equilibrium, but the outcome is not socially optimal. And then finally, like we just said, it always includes social judgments. We look at different kinds of market failures. The first market failure is when people are priced out of essential goods and services. So like, for example, college or food or housing. Now, this is not going to appear in many economics textbooks as a market failure. So I'd like you to put an asterisk next to that. That's really more something that I'm going to offer to you that I think is a market failure. But traditional economics textbooks and professors would probably not think that. And therefore, if you study econ at university, you want to be sure that you don't think of that as a market failure. But I think that because there's a number of times when government will actually do something to remedy that pricing out, I'd like to think of it as a market failure, at least a moment where governments will intervene. When markets fail to produce enough of a product with significantly positive externalities. And remember, and positive externalities are benefits that accrue to people other than the consumer. So again, for example, if you go to college, I benefit from that because even though obviously you're the chief beneficiary with the college education, maybe you discover the cure for cancer, and clearly I'm going to benefit from that. There's a positive external benefits. Society benefits more than just you, the individual, from the consumption of college. Provides too much of a product with significant negative externalities. In other words, something like cigarette smoking or secondhand smoke. I decide to have a cigarette. You have no say in the matter. You deal with my secondhand smoke. That is a negative externality, a negative external consequence of my smoking. Asymmetric information. I know things that you don't. This is a real problem in, say, financial markets, where somebody might have some insider information about the behavior of a stock. And when people don't have enough information or asymmetric information, in certain instances, we would say that's a market failure, and we do something to correct it. We have laws that require disclosure in financial markets, or we have health inspectors check the safety of a restaurant because you can't know whether or not a restaurant is safe or clean. And finally, markets fail to provide public goods. Markets, for a number of reasons, which we'll look at closely, often won't provide goods like public streets or public parks or public schools or public safety. And there's a number of reasons for that. So these are 5 instances where markets fail. These 4 are traditionally taught in college courses. This one here, being priced out of essential goods or services, that's one that I've added to the list. Looking at being priced out. When the market clearing price for an essential good or service is too high, many people can't afford. So sometimes we think of like low wages, or rent is too high, or food is too expensive, or college is too expensive. We do something to make an adjustment to that. For example, housing. Subsidies and price controls can help fix prices that we don't think are socially just. Correcting for externalities. When the market equilibrium provides a quantity of a product that's too low or too high, we can fix that with subsidies, taxes. Some cases we will institute a quota. Some cases we will prohibit that. So for example, we think that there's a public interest in correcting for the negative externalities of young people consuming alcohol. So we actually establish a quota. You may not buy any alcohol unless you're 21 years old. We also will tax alcohol. We'll subsidize college, right? We'll do a number of things to bring about the socially optimal output. And for some reason, I have the exact same slide. Oh, and we'll just skip that. Here's asymmetric information. When consumers are not able to gather perfect information about a consumption decision. Cleanliness of restaurants, financial health of companies. We can correct that through regulations. And then finally, the last one, public goods. Markets will not provide public goods. Public goods are things like things that have a very high value to society, like a public park or a public school. They're non-rivalrous. What that means is that my ability to consume that good does not limit your ability to consume it. If I eat a piece of pizza, you cannot eat it. But if I go to a public park, there's nothing to stop you from using it. Sorry, just a brief interruption there. Non-excludable. There's no practical way to exclude somebody from consuming the product, or there's no real desire to do so. There's no real practical way to prevent somebody from using the national parks. We might charge people to park their car, but there's no way to really prevent people from using nature, and nor would we want to. There's no real way to charge a price for somebody to drive down a road. Although increasingly we're finding with technology we might be able to do that, but we don't necessarily at this point want to live in a society where we have to pay a toll every time we go down a street. So a public park, a public library, markets will not provide these, because if you can't charge a price for a product, a market won't work. And then finally, the one last example of the failure of the market is a specific use case called tragedy of the commons. We know quite a bit about this here at Dana, and we're talking about the common ground. The market cannot prevent the tragedy of the commons. When a commonly owned resource is misused or overused, the market has no way to make users pay the full cost of use. And this was seen many times, unfortunately, when we have snack. There is goldfish all over the place, because there's not an easy and practical way to enforce people to pay the full cost of using the floor as a place to throw their goldfish, right? So we see air pollution, overfishing, goldfish crackers all over the floor in Arisman. We call this the tragedy of the commons, because these are resources that are commonly owned, and there's no real way, or at least it's not very easy, to ration the use of these resources.